transporting the prisoner from New Atlanta Sector 11. What's our destination?
Hey there, I'm Frankie B. In the last Frank & Beans, a lower effort and talkier series built around quicker turnarounds, I blathered on about how the games industry is really not anywhere near collapsing. In this episode, I want to dig into an apparent contradiction that I discussed in that one, that game studios which are doing well and making high profits might nevertheless be making the correct decision in laying off staff right now. The original script took me like 40 minutes to read out, and so expect a lot of gross oversimplifications that I might return to later down the line. First, let's understand the strange beast that is the post-pandemic economy, specifically involving the technology sector. Here's the S&P Technology Index, which is essentially just a bundled basket of select stocks. Even if most of the companies I discussed last time aren't included in this index, it's a really useful tool to gauge the overall performance of the field and the projections of where it might go. From this vantage point, it probably looks like a normal stock graph, but here's what it looks like when I pull the date back. Here's the NASDAQ Technology Sector Index and the Dow Jones US Technology Index, and the MSCI World Information Technology Index. There are shared companies between some of these, but the point is, tech has been in an insane golden age of growth across the board, which means that anything peripherally related to tech, like video games, has really been in a similar state, reflected in the share prices of a lot of these companies. There are 3 big years to break this all down into: 2008, 2020, and 2022.
You have been banned from the Mickey Mouse Club for inappropriate feedback.
If you watched my video about how the original 2001 Silent Hill 2 is a wildly misunderstood and as a result unfortunately overrated game, there's a tangent in the middle there wherein I explained that 2008 was the year in which the US Federal Reserve cut the interest rate to a historic low. I didn't really explain what that was or what that means necessarily in that video, so I'll touch on it a bit more here. Whenever you hear the phrase, the interest rate, people are probably talking about the central bank's interest rate for any given country. In the United States, this is called the federal funds rate. I don't know what other countries call it, but they will call it the federal funds rate after we annex them in order to secure strategic reserves of minerals like copium, cringe, Spanish, and the gamer word. Let me start flashing the oversimplification sign. That's going to come up a lot. When a bank gives out a big loan, it has a big loan-shaped hole in its assets. It needs to refill that hole to keep itself liquid, which is to say, able to return people's deposits if they withdraw them, and so that bank asks the central bank for a loan. The central bank gives it the loan that it asked for, and it attaches an interest rate to that loan. That is the federal funds rate. Individual banks also have their own interest rates, which tend to trend alongside the federal funds rate. Generally, when a bank charges you interest, it's the federal funds rate plus projected inflation, plus the bank's baseline interest, though the bank may opt to charge you even more interest if, for example, it knows that you rap on the internet about the positive health benefits of smoking crack.
What's up with that? Y'all cowards don't even smoke crack. What's up with that? Y'all cowards don't.
The lower the interest rate, the less that you have to pay back. And so lowering the federal funds rate makes debt more affordable, which means that more people and more businesses take out debt and spend it, which necessarily stimulates the economy. This tactic even has its own stopgap. All of that boosted consumption boosts demand. Boosted demand raises prices, which causes inflation. And once inflation hits the 2% mark, central banks start to raise the interest rate. Which in turn lowers consumption, lowers demand, and allows supply to catch up. lowering prices and lowering inflation. Except, as I mentioned in a video about a 24-year-old survival horror video game, inflation didn't occur in the 2010s despite that historically low interest rate, which led to a very long period of boosted consumption and a crazy bull market. It's called a bull market, you see, because it can afford to live in something better than a cuck shed.
I am Steve.
Next up, the pandemic. A lot of things are really obvious, but just to be thorough, the interest rate was dropped again to its lowest ever 0.08%, which is basically nothing. In part because of that, the market absolutely lost its mind. This was the era when your 60-something boss kept insisting that the metaverse was the future. When normal people were interested in crypto rather than exclusively people with a sexual fetish for being rug pulled. When NFTs were the hottest fashion that the professional class absolutely had to invest in. When corporations all released blithe statements at the same time about how they definitely were not racist, and please do not pay any attention to how your F*CKHH shirt was made out of cotton harvested and processed by Uyghur slave labor. Anyways, the lockdowns closed off entire industries, which required investors to, as such, move their cash around. Tech and entertainment naturally drew a lot of attention thanks to everyone being cooped up indoors, and the way that Trump bucks and Biden bucks were given out to absolutely everyone, which included professionals who were under absolutely no financial duress to speak of, that prompted a whole lot of people to suddenly just have a bunch of money sitting around that they spent in these industries, either through direct consumption or by joining in on the investment frenzy. In late 21, inflation started to rise. By 22, it was clear that, that's actually inflation, and it wasn't going away. It had woken up with a hangover that had been building for 14 years. In quarter 2 of 2022, the Federal Reserve started to raise the interest rate. That was a hike from 0.08% all the way to 5.33%. Maybe that doesn't sound like much, but here's how it looks. That was the end of an economic era. Many industries, in particular the gaming industry, were just not ready for that end. Interest rate shifts affect the entire economy, obviously, but in particular, those sectors which have unsteady returns are really hard hit. Which is to say, if I harvest a commodity, I have a loose idea of what it's worth. If I agree to build you a house, I obviously expect you to pay me, and there's sort of a market rate that I can charge. But if I make a game like Concord, I can't be sure that it'll ever hit 700 lifetime concurrent players on Steam. And the reason that the game industry is especially hurt even beyond all of that is very simple. The size of game budgets, which are paid for in debt for the most part. Think about it. If you want to buy a car, a home, or a copy of Rule of Rose for the PlayStation 2, are you going to pay for it all up front? No, you're going to take out a loan. The extra interest that you pay is well worth it for the security, the stability, and the flexibility that a loan unlocks. And businesses love these three concepts. Interest rate hikes make that kind of debt a whole lot more expensive. That gets coupled in with the increased cost of operation that inflation necessarily brings. The cost of office supplies adds up in the aggregate. Top that off with the fact that inflation also drives wage growth. Low inflation had suppressed wage growth for a long time, even before 2008. But after the 22 rate hike, wage growth started to outpace inflation. Game dev companies exploded in size while the interest rate was low and while investor sentiment was high, because if you were ever going to expand your workforce, that was the perfect time to do it. But just a little over 2 years later, all that new staff became much more expensive to retain. Because that is most of what goes into those budgets which are paid for with debt. The wages of your employees. Sure, maybe you need to contract out some music, pay a licensing fee, rent an office, acquire some kind of capital technology or something that your team needs, but mostly it's wages. those crazy budget sizes are people getting paid. Reducing those budgets means either lowering wages, reducing development time, or reducing the number of devs. Lowering wages would have pretty disastrous results, given that these companies exist in literally the most expensive places in the world to live in, and for some weird reason refuse to ever think of relocating. And furthermore, games with massive team sizes today still regularly come out with half of their content completely missing or utterly broken, and so I don't really think that cutting dev time would be a good angle either. So we turn towards layoffs and restructuring. But that isn't to say that companies immediately took to layoffs. Like I mentioned in the last Franken Beans, the abandonment of ESG and DEI really have not been related to the layoffs that started in summer of 23, because by that time, those two corporate governance strategy acronyms had already been pretty much completely abandoned. Patrick Boyle, known mostly for his rap and hip-hop news, nevertheless has excellent videos on why those acronyms were thrown overboard pretty much immediately after the interest rate hikes. Even if, yes, their effigies were burned endlessly in the 2024 political cycle. Developers also tried to raise the cost of games to keep up with inflation as another tactic. Halo 1 cost $50 in November of 2001. Today, that would be $89.93, but the market has largely resisted these efforts. A price increase of $10 per game means that the average consumer, who buys about 3 AAA slop-flop titles every single month, would be spending about $360 more a year. That is the price of about 5 DoorDash orders, and having to go without those means that certain gamers, like this guy, might starve.
Heard like nobody's business.
And therefore your winner, Wings of Redemption.
What a wake up.
Also, Steam would be eating a third of any price hike anyways. Frankie B. Editing here. If I had only not decided to shove a bunch of dumb editing jokes in this video, I might have gotten it out of the door before Nintendo's Switch 2 announcements kind of came out. They're a little relevant to this, most obvious being the price tag increases on everything. I do find it funny that people are really, really upset about $449.99, mostly because I'm old enough to remember this.
The 60 gigabyte PlayStation 3 for $599 US.
But at the same time, a lot of people are wondering what could possibly justify the price increases. Well, most obviously, despite the increased cost and the inevitable recession that's coming down the pipes, these things are gonna sell out, dude. Consumers are consumers. What do you think they do? And that's just them ripping us off, right?
No.
They're charging you for the increased costs of inflation, the increased cost of labor in the form of wages, and the cost of, the interest rate hike. Now, Japan has experienced all of these a lot differently from the United States and from the West in general. Its inflationary boom wasn't really as sharp, and its wage growth hasn't exploded like the US's did kind of after the pandemic. Japan's interest rate is a really, really interesting thing, because during the worst of the inflation shock in a lot of the West, the Japanese interest rate and the Japanese central bank decided it's going to stay flat. That is a really fascinating topic for a different time, but what it boils down to, and this is a really, really gross oversimplification, is that Japan has been in stagflation since the 1990s, and actual inflation is better than stagflation, which is a little weird. It's kind of complicated. I can't really get into it here. I might later. All you need to know is that you need to have children. In 2024, the Japanese interest rate did rise, though. It went from negative 0.1% all the way up to a whopping 0.5%. And this obviously sounds like it's absolutely nothing, but here we go. Let's look at the graph again. That is actually a pretty considerable uptick. To me, that says that these input cost increases, which are pretty considerable and don't seem to be going away anytime soon, have pressed the company to really be at the vanguard of price hikes on video games so that they can avoid having to think about laying their staff off. And honestly, these price hikes could stymie the rate of layoffs, even if they were applied to other companies throughout the industry. Now, I am someone who categorically does not buy games on release, so none of this honestly affects me. And the way I look at this is, hey, if you want to consume the slop while it's fresh, you have to pay the slop tax.
Hi, I'm Randy from Gearbox.
Do I make you Randy? Yeah.
Companies could and did try microtransactions, which, they have a reputation for being wildly profitable. And it is absolutely true that most of the people who complain online about microtransactions in order to get sweet, sweet dopamine and social approval, well, as soon as nobody's looking, they wind up buying MTX because, well, who's gonna know? The best part of having an unhealthy spending addiction isn't supporting predatory business practices, it's telling everyone online you don't. But the reality is that unless you bag the whales, microtransactions don't really make that much revenue long term. And unless your game has lots of cartoon women of dubious legal age, you're gonna have trouble attracting the attention of the tradcon alpha male demographic that spends 70% of their disposable income on gacha and titty streamer donations. So when faced with higher costs and not a lot of ways to boost revenue, most companies will turn to downsizing and to restructuring. The alternative would be to hope that you can just always and forever release smash hits, which no company is capable of. Now, it absolutely is also the case that AAA C-suite pay is just out of control, both their salaries and the bonuses that they make. But the millionaires in those suites were getting their bonuses, layoffs or not, because the share prices of these companies have been out of control. Not Ubisoft. Laying people off doesn't boost your share price. It means that you have less overhead going forward. So if your revenue stays the same, yes, it's true, you will make more profit, and yes, if your company makes more profit, the market sees that as a sign of good business health and tends to raise share prices, which tends to lead to bonuses. But the key item here is that your revenue remains steady or rises. When Blizzard Entertainment laid off 800 customer service employees in 2019, all of its products became way more insufferable, and it has some of the worst customer service in the entire industry, yet somehow ATVI's revenue surged to ridiculous amounts. Yeah, it's true. Those were pandemic years. But you're telling me that no other company out there made any games worth playing in that period. If a company makes all of its products magnitudes worse, and it makes more revenue, despite the fact that it also has more competition than at any other point before, what impetus is there for a company to care? In a lot of ways, it's really, as such, a consumer issue.
Just consume product.
But all the same, there was no company out there that could have resisted the sheer amount of opportunity that the pandemic boom presented, and there was no company out there that could resist the need to start cutting when one of the largest, sharpest interest rate spikes in history hit. The layoffs that have been rolling since 23 are the result of an entire sector of the economy making a moonshot and completely missing it. Frankie B still editing here. So there was the Nintendo announcement, and then there was Liberation Day. Because humans are humans, people now think that there's a correlation between the two, and because I cannot help myself when it comes to wasting 6 hours to make a 2-second editing gag, I'm just in time to comment on this. So, the Nintendo price hikes are not due to the tariffs. The final decision on MSRP was probably made like a year ago, if not longer, and at that point, Trump wasn't even the president-elect. Now, yeah, sure, it was probably a safe bet that the funny orange McDonald's guy would beat the comatose corpse, but big companies don't really like to make gambles like that. And anyways, when Trump's win was first announced, the markets rallied because his first term had been much, much better for them economically. You know, sure, he was talking about his love for the BBT at that point as well, but companies dismissed it. And anyways, Biden had also been making protectionist moves. The way that a tariff works is as a sudden shock to the price. Demand and supply get thrown into a really tumultuous state until they eventually figure out where they're supposed to settle at, and that takes a while. It is especially odd because these tariffs were designed by people that cannot compute 4 times a quarter. I don't personally believe that the tariffs themselves are going to have a huge direct effect on game companies, but the knock-on effects will make the trends that we've seen continue and probably exacerbate. It is not an exaggeration to say that tariffs raise the price of just about everything, and this is going to suddenly and abruptly trigger a recession in the United States at the very least. And when a country is in recession, its people spend less, and what they do spend, they spend much more carefully. By that I mean it's less that the Bing Bing Wahoo Machine 2 has gone from $450 to $50. That's the deal breaker for people. If you are gonna spend $450, you will spend $500. It's just that far, far fewer people are going to be willing to pay $450 for just about anything. That guarantees shrinking revenue for these companies, but it's hard not to wind up charging more for your products because the tariffs amplify everything that I've talked about so far. The prices on everything being higher means that your employees want more in compensation just to keep their real wages the same. And in order to retain your good employees, which in the modern age can be defined as the small minority of programmers who aren't just vibe coding everything, you're going to pay them more by cutting everyone else that you can. But that also means that once the market finds its new equilibrium, expect the exact same trend. Companies are going to continue these layoffs and cost-cutting measures, and they're going to see the efforts rewarded by their share prices rising. The cuts might even be sharper this round because the people in charge have already cut their teeth on rolling back some of the golden age largesse, which, if you haven't realized by now, is not going to come back in our lifetimes. But it's worth emphasizing, the tariffs aren't changing the trajectory so much as they're just increasing the velocity of what was already happening. It's been a bit of a longer Franken Beans already than I really like.
I'm gonna... What? What? I told you.
Frankie B, still somehow editing here. I'm just going to go off the cuff with this one, no script. Trump reversing course and putting a 30-day pause on his tariffs has led to the market starting to rally, and I think it's natural to wonder, will this change the behavior of the gaming industry? And I think it will, but I think it's going to make it even worse. See, first off, he still put in place a 10% tariff, which is still a 10% tax slapped across the board. Secondly, businesses prefer stability to instability. They always want to prepare for the worst case scenario. If you go camping in the woods and you know there's bears, you're gonna behave differently than if you don't know if there's bears. Companies don't know which of those two scenarios they're coming into, or even something like a third, where some of those bears express slightly negative opinions about one specific country and the White House decides that they need to be carpet bombed. They can't prepare for the amount of money that they'll need for the year ahead. They don't know what the overhead is going to look like. There's no idea what the market's going to look like in 3 years. So they're going to go overboard. They're going to cut costs as much as they can, maybe including higher level staff that costs more. They're going to push microtransactions. They're going to try to raise prices. You're going to see continuations of everything that you've seen, even worse than if the tariffs had come in as they were supposed to on Liberation Day. It's been a bit of a longer Franken Beans already than I really like, but I want to conclude this with a little bit of a bugbear that I have. When anyone loses their job, that sucks. It is annoying, it's stressful, and for some people it really is teetering on the precipice. But during the pandemic, learn to code was a worryingly common refrain that professional class people posted on their professional social media accounts as if it was a platitude. So to say, these dumb people, well, they just deserve their hardship. When, at the time, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau discovered the power of the Chaos Emeralds, he realized that he could declare martial law. He used it to put pressure on banks, to put pressure on people, mostly truck drivers, who were protesting his government, cutting off their access to the financial system entirely. Whatever you might think of those protests themselves, that is a move that Putin, Orban, Erdogan, and Netanyahu would be the ones that I would expect to pull. And yet, trendy socialites cheered it on, and the popular thing was to mock the people that he targeted with that tactic. Then, not even 3 years later, when a 14-year bull run finally ended, game developers suddenly became a protected class, highly paid professionals who almost all got severance packages, who all have in-demand skills, needed protecting from the evils of capitalism. But the truckers and the restaurant workers and the retail workers and the shop workers, no, them it was a moral imperative to mock. Look, we live in an era of the internet. If I want to find any weird esoteric position, I can find it. And I can take that stupid position and pretend that it reflects the entirety of my political opponents. It's one of the oldest, dumbest, sleaziest tricks in the book, and I hate it. So I certainly acknowledge that it wasn't everyone sneering learn to code. And I certainly acknowledge that the people currently making fun of game developers who have lost their jobs are kinda assholes. But it's also true that learn to code was a much more mainstream sentiment than the inversion. The learn to code people and the people now making fun of laid-off devs are going to be locked in an eternal cycle of nihilistic self-destruction, which is colloquially known as the culture war. They will spend the rest of their lives pandering to social cliques filled with people that don't actually like each other, even just a little bit, and they will waste whole days and weeks of their lives doing nothing more than getting mad at something on the internet, repeating mantras, and pretending that this somehow is a marker of integrity and purpose. They will never touch grass, for they haven't been in contact with the real world for a long, long time by now. Don't become a partisan in the culture war, the fine art of making yourself miserable as you make everyone else miserable. Instead, join me here in the peanut gallery. We get to laugh at everybody, including ourselves. This was originally just going to be a 10-minute video, which took me a lot longer to explain than I had first thought. And then I had those other topics added in, so hey, if you've made it this far, thanks for sticking it out with me. Normally I'd find a funnier way to say this, if I said it at all, but if you liked the video, given its serendipitously timely nature, please do like, share, don't beat your wife, and subscribe. The next video is going to be much, much shorter and much, much simpler. See you around, hopefully, in, well, I said 2 weeks last time, and then I rushed to get this one done in 3, so who knows, soon enough. soon enough.
totally pouting, you. This is embarrassing. No, not even try. Come on, really try to actually beat me this time.
I am trying. You keep ramming me.
No, you're not actually trying, are you? I mean, maybe if you really, really tried. You suck. It's like you're not even playing.